name is Cindy Marques. I am the co-founder and CEO at MakeCents, a fee-only financial planning firm for millennials undertaking major life moves. We help you make sense of your money. And I'm joined by Mallory McGrath of Viive Planning. Mallory, tell us a little about yourself.
Hi, Cindy. Thanks for having me back again. So at Viive Planning, we work with clients and their families to collaboratively plan for the aging and end-of-life process.
Okay, awesome. Today, we are going to talk about how to manage risk, emotional risk, financial risk. Last time we talked about the importance of planning and how to approach it. Let's now dive into that process of planning and what it means to fail to plan versus what it can look like if you take the steps ahead of time. And, you know, without jumping too far into the future, for end of life, a lot of the times the conversation starts with me, in my case, with just wrapping our heads around your cash flow and your budgeting and the debt management. You're inundated with all of these things and stressors today that many of us sort of disregard. I can't even think about retirement. I don't even know how to fathom it. I don't know how to compute the aging process or death in general. That feels so far away. But, you know, we did just survive a pandemic. And I think that for a lot of us, the reality of death and critical illness feels a lot closer, feels more real, feels like less of this distant concept that older people talk about and try to scare us into worrying about, and it feels real. And so, you know, in my case, if we want to, you know, take it back to the fundamentals of cash flow planning, and the problem with failing to plan appropriately, a lot of clients, you know, enter each month figuring it out on a whim. Will I be able to afford rent? Will I be able to pay my bills? I don't know. I'll just figure it out. And when I'm trying to actually implement a cash flow plan, I do see clients quickly disregard when I ask them, okay, what do you actually spend on this or this or this? They disregard the real numbers and give me their ideals about, okay, I'd like to keep it to this. I'm like, okay, it's nice, but what are you actually doing? Because I can create a plan that's based on flat, but it's more meaningful if we take some time to actually criticize and look at the reality of the situation. How have you actually been spending your money? What are your real habits? And then we can create something real and concrete from there, as opposed to just basing it on fluff. So I think a lot of people are not only afraid to talk about those meaty planning things in the future, but many of us are afraid to even just look at the real numbers of how we spend our money on the day-to-day life. Do you find that resonates at all with you in how you work with your clients?
Actually, yeah, a client of mine came to mind as you were describing that, and it had to do with actually reflecting on her aging process. And what brought it up was when you were talking about people talking about their ideals, right? And what they want to be spending versus what they actually are. And I think it can be applied, that sort of mentality, to this story where she was describing, so this is a woman in her early 60s, and she's describing to me her family history. So she mentions to me that her mother died from Alzheimer's. And then she mentions to me that her mother's sister died from Alzheimer's and that her own sister died from Alzheimer's.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm sitting here and I said, okay, have you had the test to see if you have the gene? And she said, no, I don't want to know. I said, fine, totally fine, your choice. And I said, well, then let's talk about your aging process. She goes, oh, well, I'm very, very healthy. I have no doubt that I'll live a very long life. And I said, okay, but you might live a very, very long life with Alzheimer's. And she's like, I mean, the likelihood's very low. And I'm sitting here going, hello, I'm pretty sure the likelihood is very, very high. You just described, but it's, you know, I think obviously there's some trauma there. She's watched 3 women in her life die from this horrific disease and be lost in it, right? I mean, it's this disease where you lose the person, even though they might still physically be living, right? And so that trauma has, in a way, glazed over, and she's just allowed herself to be forward focused and not acknowledging anything. And I don't mean that you need to be negative. I mean, be positive, think for that, 100-year-old goal and living your best life. And that's great. But there needs to be a level of realism involved, a level of understanding that you've got a very high chance of developing this disease. And are you financially prepared for that? Is your family emotionally and socially prepared? Emotional and social needs are very different. How a family is going to handle seeing someone deteriorate It's a bunch of individual adults with their opinions and minds doing their own thing, working through their own grief over seeing mom deteriorate. It's a lot of people with a lot of emotions. And if you can have conversations around that very early on, whether if it's right at the onset of diagnosis of Alzheimer's as an example, or even before, just on the notion that maybe it will happen one day, that allows a whole family to be forward thinking and positive, but also have that level of realism. And I think that's kind of similar to what you're saying, where clients, they know what they're spending, but they want to be, optimistic and driven and focused on achieving their goals, but they're spending an extra $300 a month on eating out, right? And they need to figure out a way to reconcile both of those together and come to terms with it.
That's right. It's the reconciliation part that's important, because you're right. We like to live with the ideals, and that's what's going to drive us forward towards, change and betterment. But you need to start from a place of reality. And I think, just as your client was afraid to accept the possibility that, her aging process might not be so shiny. So too, most people are just afraid to even accept that, I know I spend too much on dining out, or I know I have a bit of a shopping problem. And although we are driven by these goals, these lofty, beautiful goals, the reality of the situation keeps stunting us. And if we don't actually look at the numbers, look at the real situation, and compare our ideals to the reality, we can't come up with a pathway to connect the two, right? We're just sort of looking over there and hoping it's true, but we're living over here. So we need to see both of them clearly so that we can create the pathway. And that's what both of us do in regards to the planning process. So that is very interesting. And you know what, my family as well has faced Alzheimer's. My grandfather has Alzheimer's, and my grandmother passed from COVID right before the pandemic was declared. And so my parents moved in with my grandfather to provide in-home care, because at that stage, to take him out of the place he is familiar with, where all of his, ingrained habits exist, would probably just make him deteriorate faster. So they did what they needed to do. They stepped up, they moved in. And, that had my parents seeing this and worried too about their own process. How will I age? What do I need to do to put in place? But it's scary to talk about the process of planning for that. It's scary to accept that, our future may not be as shiny. It's scary to accept that maybe our impulse control today when it comes to spending is not so great either. But we need to be realistic about all of this. And again, I think that having survived a pandemic changes our minds about a lot of things, especially again, about things like planning for death. Now, I am an insurance broker, and so I like having conversations with millennials about insurance. And I enjoy it mostly because for me, it ends up typically being a refreshing experience, because many of these individuals have come from a place of either working with their parents' guy or someone else who was very, very pushy or salesy. They left a bad taste in their mouth and makes them hate insurance. Like, yuck, it's that product that some smooth, slick, finger gun pointing salesman is going to try to sell me on. And I'm like, yuck, that sounds like a gross product. I don't understand it, because they don't take the time to explain. For me, I approach it from like, let's talk about this, what it can do for you. And usually from that literacy comes that sense of, wow, you're right. This is a good thing for me. This is so amazing. I never understood it before, but you made it seem so clear. You're right. This is important. And I actually do feel good about buying it. It's achieving that peace of mind. And are you having similar experience? Especially, let's focus in on working with millennials and their attitudes about death, since we're talking about insurance. What are you finding is a connection there?
I mean, the millennials are being coined as being this death positive generation. There's a lot of death positivity. We are also very focused on being very environmentally friendly as a generation. And so that's actually getting wrapped up in death positivity. We have trusted partners at Viive, and one of ours is Irene Cremations. They offer cremation and aquamation services. And aquamation is like the greener way to do cremation, right? And there's a lot of ways that we as a generation are making making our wishes known. Whether they're being made known in an official and legally binding sense is another conversation, but we're more open to talking about these topics, it seems, as a generation. I think because we are young adults, some of us verging on that middle-aged adult time, and we still have grandparents alive. And so we're really getting to see that the boomers in that sandwich generation and how they are how it's affecting them to have parents still alive. And I think that having that death positivity in our generation is really vital and a great first stepping stone. But what I've noticed is that millennials are very okay with saying the statement, yeah, of course, I'm going to die. Like, they get it, they know, they see the generations above them still living, they know that they're going to die and that they themselves are going to die as well. But it's hard for them to recognize the idea, I think, especially pre-COVID, the idea of dying prematurely. So dying young and leaving behind your family and loved ones and whatnot. And I think COVID has helped with that, because we did see a number of young people die from this horrible disease, and not die quickly, die slowly and horribly, which left very traumatized families behind, traumatized emotionally, but also financially, because they were not ready for those deaths. I mean, I remember reading an article in the States about this couple that both died within 10 days of each other and left behind 3 children. And they were, I mean, they, both contracted COVID, they were unvaccinated, they did not have wills, they did not have insurance. And those 3 kids are just, I mean, they're orphaned. And obviously there will be a support system that steps in, but, it could have been a lot. Financially, it could have been a lot easier, or legally, it could have been a lot easier if plans had been in place. Obviously, emotionally, there's no making that easier. So, I mean, my hope is that COVID will, in a way, benefit the millennial generation, that we will see the need for obtaining insurance, for planning for premature deaths, so that we can ensure that our families are as secure as possible and can focus on the grieving process if something were to happen to us.
Yeah, I agree. I underwent a lot when the pandemic first hit as well. In my family and my household, there was a lot happening, and I had to take a step away from my practice just to get my mind right. But I found that even though I was trying to step away, I suddenly had a lot of people coming to me actively seeking help because they were scared. They lost their jobs. And I come from the hospitality industry myself. I worked as a server bartender for almost a decade. And most of the individuals in my network are from that industry. And so that was terrifying, because the restaurant hospitality industry suffered the brunt of it for the longest time, even as, measures of easing into normal life happened. It's a hospitality industry that was left hanging for a very long time. And they were really freaked out, without a job, without, a support system, with the very real situation of people around them getting very sick and passing away. I think that it is very apparent, and that people our age are scared and are ready to accept the fact that, what, I think that this whole living on a whim and I'll figure it out month to month is not quite gonna cut it, because before the pandemic it was like emergency funds, okay, whatever, I'll get around to it. Right now I'm more concerned about my trip to Greece or whatever it may be. And then it hits and they're like, oh my God, I used every last savings, I used every dollar of credit I had available, I am maxed out beyond belief, and now this is something I'm going to spend years trying to dig myself out of. So I do think it's very real, but I wanted to circle back quickly and clarify with you, what do you mean by death positivity? Because again, I do accept that. I think that our eyes are open, we are aware, but what do you mean that we're positive about it?
I think that is more vocal, that millennials are more willing to talk about death, to talk about their wishes for death. I don't mean planning for death. I think that's very different. But I think we're much more willing to talk about the fact that we will die. Oh yeah, I heard about that acclamation thing. What's that about? We're much more like, imagine sitting at a coffee house, like Friends style, and just talking with your friends, and and talking about death in a very open way. And it's not considered a downer. It's not considered, oh God, you're so depressing to talk about that. It's just a normal conversation topic for us. I think maybe because we as adults, it used to be that you lost your grandparents when you were younger, right? Younger than we are now. You didn't really have grandparents alive when you were in your 30s, right? And so there's a lot of us who are going through family deaths now in our 30s and seeing that. And so we obviously have a very different emotional connection to death than we would have as a child. And so that's causing a lot of self-reflection. I mean, you go to a funeral, there's no way, like, unless you're completely unfeeling, that you don't start to reflect on your own demise. I don't know how you avoid that. And depending who the person is that died or who their family was. I mean, if you go to the funeral of someone who has young children and you have young children yourself, that becomes a very deep reflective moment of, oh my God, poor so-and-so is all alone raising his kids. I hope that they're okay. And that's why you see all these GoFundMes coming up, right? Because families are not prepared for premature deaths. However, I do think that we as a generation are open to conversations on the topic, but I don't think, because of something I think we talked about in our last talk, they have the ability to execute plans because they're so trapped behind a lot of the milestones that they want to achieve still. I mean, this housing market is comical that we're in right now, and how are millennials expected to buy houses? I mean, I have no idea how. We just bought a house, my husband and I. Luckily, we had a condo to sell. I think that's the only way we pulled it off. I don't know if we would have been able to enter the market. And, millennials are making more money than any generation before them, but they also don't have pensions. Right? We're going to be that first generation without pensions from employers, right? We're still CPP and old age pension, but not having pensions from employers is something as well that really has to be talked about. And I think all of that wraps up into the sort of death positivity movement, the idea that we can talk about death, we can talk about aging, we can talk about money, but then I think still the next step for millennials is the execution of those conversations. What do we do after we sit with our friends and talk about cremation services? Do we actually go out and buy a plan so that we have prepaid cremation services? Probably not. So we need to figure out a way to move to that next step with millennials.
Yeah, I would agree with you that millennials are ready to openly talk about these things. And I think because we grew up with the boom of the internet and social media, we're used to being able to voice an opinion. Yes. Valid or not, we're just used to being able to put it out there, and we all have an opinion. And so we're ready to talk about literally anything and feel like, no, I want to be proactive about this versus reactive. But you're right, there is there needs to be some reconciliation between the execution of goals and our ideals and aspirations. Like, I think there is a disconnect between the ideals we're chasing and the realities we're facing. And I think that it matters a lot. I had a point here and I lost it mid-sentence. Oh no! I wanted to say, and I lost it mid-sentence. But you're right. We want to be reactive, and I think we're more comfortable talking about things like death. We know that it's something that is going to happen, and as opposed to just like, okay, we know it, but we don't have to talk about it because that's morbid. Let's not mention it. I know that myself in conversation with friends, I'm just like, you know what? I'd really like to just be, turned into a tree when I die, like just casually like, oh, isn't that lovely? We care about the environment. We care about the impact we leave. So we do want to be proactive about these things. Just like we all know that at some point we need to get invested, but investing is not enough. A lot of us are like, yes, but I also want to make sure I do it in a socially responsible way. That's another thing that's coming up is socially responsible investing. So there's a lot of things that in the past we know is coming, we know that we must do, but we don't really talk about it because it's like, whatever, I'll get to it when I get to it. But now we're all very opinionated. We want to be proactive and we know we need to do these things, but we are starting to realize that we have a choice in terms of how it's done, and that these choices impart a reaction to the environment and the communities around us. And that's something I think the millennial demographic does care a lot about is, social governance, equity and justice, and environmentally sustainable measures. Like, all of these things matter. And so conversations about deaths, conversations about how we invest, etc., it's getting more interesting, but again, is it just like, insightful conversation over brunch to be interesting, or are you gonna act on it
Yeah,
and do something about it? There's still a bit of a
exactly.
disconnect there.
And I think that the risk of not taking that next step, of not moving past brunch and actually sitting down, with your spouse or your loved ones and actually like putting together a plan, is the fact that, when you become incapacitated or sick or you die, no matter your age, I mean, we could, talk about the downsides for any generation, but no matter your age, you are leaving people behind. Whether they be biological family or chosen family or support system, you're leaving people behind that have to wrap up your life from an estate administration standpoint, from a financial standpoint. But they're doing this while grieving and suffering through your loss. And if it is an unexpected death, a premature death, I mean, that's going to, they're so traumatized, yet given this immense task of administering your estate or, wrapping up your affairs in whatever way. And when we don't plan ahead and when we don't communicate those plans, which for me is as equally as important, because I came from the estate litigation world before I came to Viive. If we don't communicate those wishes, then we're actually just we're almost, starting the fire, the emotional jealousy, greed fire for the family and loved ones to just have fun with after you're gone. And I think that that's really important, is that we are looking at what the emotional repercussions are as well as financial. And I mean, traditionally, estate planning is being done by lawyers and financial advisors of some kind. And I always say, lawyers are awesome, financial advisors are awesome, lawyers are legal, financial advisors are financial. Who's looking at your family? Who's looking at the dynamics? Who's looking at the emotional fallout that could occur when you're incapacitated and someone needs to become your guardian, or after you die? And I mean, some advisors and some lawyers, they'll go down that path, but it's not their job at the end of the day. They have their jobs and they do them really, really well, and they're vital to the planning process. But sometimes we need to really think about, how are our wishes being communicated? How are we expressing them? How are we making sure everyone understands? And really making that sort of the third part of the planning pyramid, is making sure that our family and support system is very keenly aware of all the other plans that we've made, and then moving forward with those plans and getting them done and in place as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I think, it's not just a matter of millennials, being starry-eyed and we have these great ideas and wishes, but being too lazy to act on it. I think that there is some intimidation with approaching the professional, because usually it is a professional like yourself or myself that helps connect those two worlds of what you aspire to, and implementing the process and connecting and providing a holistic approach that takes the legal, the financial side, the emotional, the familial side of things, and wraps that all together in a meaningful way that gives you some kind of guidance. I think that it is difficult for our generation to find a professional that we trust, that we can relate to, because many of us are just like very anti our parents' guy. You know what I mean? Like mom and dad are like, oh, just use my guy for accounting, or use my guy for this. And we're like, no, like we really distrust financial systems in general. We've lived through the Great Recession in 2008. We lived through a pandemic. A lot of us have lost our jobs. We really distrust banking institutions and large institutions to always be there. And so we know that we need professional guidance, but we're wary of the traditional approach. And so, I think that you've carved out a very unique space. It's not like you're not quite specifically an estate lawyer, because I think that approaching a lawyer is like, ooh, sounds expensive. And then like, well, I'm not your typical financial planner, financial advisor, because that feels like, that sounds like they're just going to try to sell me something or talk at me. And like, neither of us are either of these two old traditional models. We're in the middle. We've carved out a niche for ourselves. But unfortunately, I feel like professionals like ourselves who took the time to carve this new path to cater to the millennials' needs and desired approach is still lacking. So professionals are like us are few and far between, I feel still.
Yeah.
And so I think it's difficult for people to find someone to help them make those meaningful connections and
Oh,
implement
definitely.
ideals.
And that's definitely something, like when I was building my trusted partner roster at Viive, I had to think about, okay, when I'm bringing someone on, obviously I want them to be exceptional at their job and have very similar morals and values when working with a client that we do. But it was also picking people generationally and understanding who a millennial would want to work with. I find millennials really want to work with millennials. Maybe a young Gen X, maybe they'll go up, but they don't want to work with a boomer because then they just feel like they're being parented and they have no interest in that. Whereas boomers, they'll work with someone younger. I mean, I have a lot of boomer clients. They're willing to work with me. I find financially, they would like to go with someone their age. And so that was something I had to consider is, okay, what do these generations want out of their service providers? Because if I'm just bringing on, I mean, if I think of growing a company, I think of obviously bringing on people of different ages, but I'm thinking about the next 30 years. So I'd like to bring on people who are going to be working like me for the next 30 years. But I also have to think about the clients and what they want. And they sometimes want people, they want their peers. And so it's important to find really great industry professionals who are from other generations, but are very aware of the fact that we need to start, no matter the age of our client, planning in a different way. It needs to be much more holistic. We need to be forming, in my opinion, emotional connections with clients. And I'm sure a lot of regulatory boards out there would disagree, but I think that's important. We're asking them to be intimate with us, to be financially intimate, to be emotionally intimate. I mean, the things I learn about families, I feel like I'm a part of their family. And that I think is really key. And I think millennials, cell phones came into our lives when we were sort of in our grade 8, 9, 10 years, right? And we're not as inundated with technology the way, say, people who are in high school now are, where that's like their whole life. But I think we have a responsibility to make sure that we establish a really great sort of baseline for what financial and estate planning is going to look like for the future. Because there's all these amazing tech companies out there, some of which are even trusted partners at Viive. And I think that there is a niche market for estate-based tech products, but we don't want everything to just be on our phone. We don't want everything to be tech related. Having that human interaction and being able to form those relationships and build trust, as you do with clients, as I do, is really key. Having I say this to my personal trainer, I just want you to be the best friend that I pay. To just I say that to her literally in my intake form. I'm like, I need a best friend that I pay to tell me to do my workout the next day. And that's kind of what I say to people. Like, think of me like, if I'm talking to boomers, think of me like the daughter that you're paying. Like, that's what I am, but I don't have any real emotional or financial vest in what you're doing. So I'm good. Right. And when I talk with millennials, think I'm your nagging older sister. Okay, I'm just going to get stuff done, and that's the relationship we need to form. And I think that you're right. There needs to be more of these businesses that you and I've created so that millennials take this seriously and so that they do it earlier and so that then they can reflect that to the generation below them.
Yeah. And I think for, any professionals in our industries watching and listening to this, the key takeaway here is that empathy can't, be disregarded. It is very, very important. And because we are wary of the traditional models of the institutions we're talking about, we don't want that. But we also want, it to be tech friendly and tech ready. We want that to be integrated into, our worlds are already so seamlessly run by efficient tech. So we want that, but not to be fully roboticized. There needs to be the human element. So prove to me why it's valuable to work with you. And again, it's that peer-to-peer connection, that empathy, that sense of understanding of you know what, I get what you're going through. And here's my story. And I remember being trained in this industry. I was like, don't talk about your personal life. Don't ever tell the client about your debts or your problems. What? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I talk about it all the time. You see this behind me? This costs money. I'm still paying it off.
Yeah.
I get it. I was talking to my clients, I'm not here to talk at you. This is behind me as a reminder of the debts that I'm still paying, of the stress I'm still dealing with, that I get what you're facing. You're just trying to get on with your life and be successful, but you're still being weighed down by these worries. And I get it. I share intimate details, not too intimate details all the time to show that like, hey, I'm you, you know, I don't get dressed up in a stiffy suit. I'm just like,
no,
I'm in a t-shirt, you're in a t-shirt. It's more approachable. Let's talk like human beings who get each other, and let's agree that this is an important conversation to have. So let's do this. So I just feel like, again, for professionals listening, you know, empathy matters. Taking an emotional approach does matter. And it's what people are looking for, because our demographic is very eager to plan and to implement. The problem is that many of them can't do it on their own. And unfortunately, they don't feel like there are enough professionals who really get it to make that magic happen.
Exactly. No, I completely agree with you. And I mean, hopefully that's something we start to see. I mean, we saw, you know, I think that because of COVID, we'll see a big sort of influx of entrepreneurs in our generation, right? Who either lost their jobs or went, oh, I can't handle being in the corporate sphere anymore, and went out on their own. And maybe that's something that we start to see more of. I mean, I also think that for the very traditional estate planners, the lawyers, financial advisors, or planners and accountants, I mean, they dealt with a lot during COVID. They dealt with death, they dealt with families freaking out. And I think that was also a really big reminder to them that they can't, you know, keep clients at arm's length, obviously represent them well, but keep them emotionally, shall we say, at arm's length, because making a will is incredibly emotional. Picking powers of attorney is emotional. Investing your money, taking that risk, is very emotional. You can't remove emotion from these very strategic choices that you make in life. And I hope that a lot of those traditional professionals will take into account what has happened during COVID and really kind of turn that into the work that they do with clients.
Yeah, that's a good way to wrap it up. And I guess to summarize what we talked about today, at the end of the day, you know, millennials have great ideals, but there's a problem with implementation. And we know that millennials care a lot. We want to do things. We want to be proactive and not just reactive to our life circumstances. Don't let traditional models be what stops you from actually implementing these beautiful ideals and goals that you have. You know, as the prospective client, the consumer, do your due diligence. If you care enough about it, and I know that you do, I know that it's on your mind and that you're stressed about it, do a bit of research, look on platforms that you're on, such as Instagram, where you feel like I'm more likely to find someone like me there. Like, yes, you know, if you don't feel like the bank houses people who live a life representative of yours, then don't go there. Go where you spend your time. You're more likely to spend someone like you. I'm sure if you do enough digging, you're going to find a Cindy, you're going to find a Mallory. And so we encourage you to act on it, to plan, to make your dreams a reality. Don't just bump into walls. It can be very, very scary when you don't, you know, make appropriate plans. Anything else to throw in there, Mallory?
No, you summed that up so well. I liked it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again for taking the time to chat with me. It's always a pleasure, Mallory. Until next time, and thank you all for watching.
Thank you, Cindy. Bye.